Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when public hygiene was optional. Shoes were mostly theoretical, and the idea of a balanced diet was eat whatever doesn't kill you. You're standing in the middle of a bustling medieval fairground, somewhere between the fishmonger and a man selling miracle teeth when the smell hits you. Sweet, fried, slightly smoky. Someone nearby is hawking hot fritters, sizzling in bear fat, glistening with honey, and served in rough linen napkins. You reach for one and the heat nearly burns your fingers. You bite in anyway. It's crunchy, sticky, and dangerously good. You will not be eating just one. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least your last meal will be delicious. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're already settled in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is, because somewhere out there, someone else is falling asleep to this exact same smell of deep-fried disaster. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the ironsmith, past the brewer, singing off-key until you reach the source of the sugar-laced aroma, a ramshackle wooden stall draped in embroidered cloth and surrounded by a gaggle of sticky-faced children. A woman behind the counter is dunking chunks of batter into a bubbling cauldron of oil. The batter fizzes and dances before she fishes it out with a slotted ladle. She rolls the golden lumps in crushed almonds and drizzles them with syrup. A fritter, she tells you, made with flour yeast eggs if available, and seasoned with herbs or sometimes even rose petals. It tastes like medieval heaven. Medieval markets weren't just for salted meat and pickled despair. They were full of indulgent, fleeting pleasures. Traveling food sellers and local cooks alike brought recipes to fairs and feast days that didn't show up in sober daily meals. These weren't things a family could afford, and every day many couldn't afford them even once a year. But fairs were special. They gave peasants a taste of sugar, of oil-cooked magic, of treats the body might regret, but the tongue would never forget. Historians still argue whether the concept of junk food even applies to medieval life. But fair snacks definitely check the modern boxes: fast, cheap, relatively deep-fried, and nutritionally dodgy. Take, for example, the famed bunyols of Catalonia. These were essentially medieval doughnuts, fried golden and dusted with sugar or drenched in honey. They were sold warm from the cauldron and popular enough to cross borders in recipe books. Some versions included cheese curds. Others were made with chickpea flour. If you think that sounds healthy, don't worry. They dunked it in lard for extra regret. Sometimes vendors carried their goods on foot using large trays suspended from their necks. Others set up tents and slapped together makeshift ovens on the spot. The average medieval street food vendor had no permits, no health code, and no shame. But they did have skills. People lined up, coins in hand, for piping hot apple fritters, sugared nuts roasted in iron pans, or even almond pastries baked over open flame. And then there was the ultimate crowd pleaser, honeyed almonds. Easy to carry, hard to resist. Vendors stirred raw almonds in boiling honey and spices, letting the mixture crystallize as it cooled. They were sweet, crunchy, and lasted longer than a meat pie on a summer day. If you had teeth left after 30 congratulations, you probably cracked a few on these. Not all fair treats were sugary. Some stalls sold peppered meatballs, spiced chickpea patties, or even grilled cheese pockets with garlic sauce. But the sweet stuff ruled the scene. Sugar was still an expensive import, so even a pinch in your pastry was a big deal. This made fairground indulgences double as status symbols. If you could afford fritters with saffron or candied orange peel, people noticed. One recipe from a 14th century English manuscript describes a rishus of little fried balls filled with dates, figs, and spices rolled in breadcrumbs and fried in, well, something that was once part of a pig. You might call them medieval fruit gushers, only with more pig and fewer ethics. Every year, a few of these stalls caught fire because apparently dunking batter in hot oil while surrounded by hay and drunk stonemasons wasn't the safest business model. Still, people came back. Again and again. You would too. And of course, food wasn't just about taste. It was about spectacle. Picture a fairground cook twirling fried dough on a stick, stretching it into knots mid-air like a medieval food influencer. Or a juggler balancing a tray of spiced fritters while a monkey in a tunic collects coins from the crowd. You haven't lived until you've locked eyes with a monkey holding your dessert hostage. Now you're starting to feel that warm medieval fullness, that post-fritter haze where everything smells like smoke and syrup and sweat. You lie down on the edge of the square under a cart, nibbling one last sugared fig. Children dart by, licking honey off their wrists. Somewhere a pig escapes and chaos ensues. But you stay. Because this, dear listener, is the guilty pleasure of the past. A fairground, a fritter, and a very real chance of dysentery. You wake up in the sticky afterglow of medieval indulgence, but the fair isn't done with you yet. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across muddy paths and the occasional puddle of mead. Your fingers are still coated with something vaguely sweet and probably not hygienic, but your stomach grumbles again because of course it does. You round a corner and there it is. Another stall. This one's fronted by a bald man with a toothless grin and an apron that's seen things. He's standing over a cauldron of oil, and you already know deep-fried something awaits. This, my friend, is where you meet the deep-fried ancestors of today's doughnuts. And they are weird. The medieval version of fried dough varied wildly, depending on where you were and how fancy you were pretending to be. In England, they called them Crispell's flat, deep-fried cakes of flour yeast, and sometimes cheese seasoned with rosewater or saffron. In France, they went by orelettes, or little ears, thin and crispy sweets dusted in sugar, and often flavored with orange blossom water. Italy had frittelle, a broader term that encompassed all things battered, fried, and blissfully unhealthy. You lean closer to the bubbling pot, and the smell is complicated. There's heat, grease, sweetness, and something floral, almost perfume-like. The cook explains that he's using goose fat for depth, and that his fritters are filled with soft cheese and a dash of cinnamon. You blink. Cheese and cinnamon together. But in the 1300s, that wasn't strange. That was luxury. Historians still argue whether deep-fried treats were an invention of the elite, the poor, or a happy accident caused by someone dropping their bread dough into a pot. One theory says oil frying was adopted from Arab culinary traditions during the Crusades and then mutated across Europe like some delicious grease-borne virus. Another claims it was always lurking in kitchens, just waiting for someone to get drunk and experimental. What we know for sure is that frying was expensive. Oil, whether from olives, nuts, or rendered animals, was not something peasants used lightly. So when frying happened, it was for special occasions. Feast days, weddings, markets, or more rarely, when you had access to old bacon fat and zero shame. One widely copied recipe from a 14th century French cookbook describes fritters made from wheat dough stuffed with curd cheese and sugar pinched shut like a dumpling, then dunked into oil and cooked until golden. Once cooled, they were rolled in powdered ginger or cinnamon. It was less crispy cream and more medieval hot pocket, but still a hit. There was also the medieval favorite known as frumenty fritters. These used leftover porridge mixed with eggs and flour formed into little patties and fried. You'd eat them with honey or vinegar depending on whether you were feeling festive or just confused. And remember, this was a world where vinegar counted as a flavor enhancer. One English source from the 15th century records Slight's clever dishes, including fried pastries stuffed with fish figs or almonds. Sometimes these were molded into animal shapes, because why not eat a dolphin-shaped fritter at your uncle's plague survivor party? You crouch beside the stall as the vendor hands you a paper-thin crisple. It bends under its own buttery weight and immediately drops a glob of hot grease onto your tunic. You don't care. The first bite is heaven. The second, still good, if a bit weird. The third, you're thinking you probably shouldn't have eaten that honey-drenched almond roll beforehand. But hey, hindsight is for the living. Jokes aside, deep-fried food in the Middle Ages was sometimes dangerous. Not just to your digestion, but literally. Kitchens were open-fire operations. The risk of flames catching onto grease or clothing was very real. Monks in one abbey were banned from frying during Lent, not for moral reasons, but because they kept setting things on fire. And yet people kept doing it. Because deep-fried food, greasy, golden, unapologetically extra, tasted incredible. Even with the strange spices, even with the accidental bones, even when dipped in things you now recognize as suspiciously close to gravy. The sheer creativity of medieval cooks is worth appreciating. They didn't just fry dough and leave it at that. Some added almond milk and saffron to the batter. Others filled fritters with spiced fruit pastes. Some tossed in candied orange peel or even finely chopped herbs. Sweet, savory, and everything in between, it was all on the table, sometimes literally mixed in one dish. And then there were the traveling fryer cooks. Like modern food trucks without the truck, these folks roamed towns during festivals, setting up mobile frying operations and making good money from hungry crowds. They were often viewed with a mix of admiration and disgust, kind of like how we view people who eat fried butter at state fairs. You lie back now, hands on your belly, eyes half closed as the smell of goose fat and burnt sugar swirls in the dusk. The cook is still working, tossing fritters to kids and nobles alike. Somewhere a dog licks spilled batter from the dirt, and no one stops it. You close your eyes. The last thing you hear is the sizzle of dough meeting oil. Deep fried, definitely questionable, and absolutely unforgettable. You wake slowly, the scent of fried batter fading into something bubblier. Rich, sweet, and fermented with a faint herbal twang. You sit up, blinking at a wooden sign shaped like a goblet, hanging from an iron bracket above a low tavern door. A man stumbles out, cheeks flushed, clutching a clay cup and singing something that may once have rhymed. You follow the sound of sloshing mugs and find yourself in a medieval tap room, dimly lit, smoky, and brimming with the sticky promise of sugar-laced drinks. Welcome to the dangerously sweet world of medieval beverages. Mead ale, syrupy cordials, and curious infusions that toe the line between comforting nightcap and medicinal hallucination. Your fingers brush the wooden mug handed to you by the innkeeper. It's warm from nearby hearth heat, and the drink inside glows amber in the light. Mead fermented honey wine spiced with herbs like hyssop or thyme, depending on how much of an herbalist your bartender was pretending to be. Mead was one of the oldest sweetened drinks in the medieval world, and for good reason. Honey kept well. It masked the bitterness of whatever was brewing. It turned otherwise questionable liquids into something well drinkable. And most importantly, it got the job done. Historians still argue whether medieval sweet drinks were more recreational or medicinal. But one thing's for sure, you didn't always know what was in them. And that was part of the fun. Beyond mead, there was posset, a warm concoction of milk, curdled with ale or wine and thickened with sugar and eggs. Sounds questionable, right? But imagine it like a proto-eggnog minus refrigeration and plus a higher chance of surprise curdles, sometimes flavored with nutmeg or rosewater. It was offered to the sick, the cold, or frankly anyone looking for an excuse to sleep the afternoon away. Then there were the syrups, not the maple kind. Think of them as medieval energy drinks, sugar or honey boiled with herbs, flowers, even spices like pepper or cloves. These syrups were diluted with water or wine poured over snow if you were rich, or just guzzled straight if you had no shame. They went by names like syrup of violets or cordial of roses, and were often prescribed by physicians, as if that made them any less of a guilty pleasure. Your innkeeper gestures toward a dark red bottle thick as tar. Cherry cordial, he says, sweetened with honey, thickened with almond milk, and possibly laced with poppy syrup. You take a sip. It tastes like a fruit roll-up had a secret affair with NyQuil. Delicious, slightly terrifying. But let's talk about ale. Medieval ale was everywhere. Water wasn't always safe, and ale was the safer, tastier alternative. It wasn't always boozy, but it was often sweetened with malt, and sometimes spiced, depending on the brewer's flair. Some taverns added fruit mash or herbs, not because they were master mixologists, but because they were trying to cover up off flavors. Spoilage was common, but sugar and spice could save the batch. Alewives. Yes, that's the term. Were often women running brewing operations from their homes. Some added fennel, coriander, even bits of ginger to make their batch stand out. Others relied on sweetness, honey, dried fruit, or molasses. If you've ever had a questionable craft beer from a guy with too many tattoos and not enough refrigeration, you're halfway there. Of course, not every drink was for the masses. The nobility enjoyed Hippocras wine spiced with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sweetened until it could qualify as a dessert. Hippocras was filtered through a spice bag, which sounds like medieval slang but isn't, and served at banquets to aid digestion. Supposedly. It probably just gave people the hiccups. And then there was the ultimate medieval sugar bomb, claret, a bright spiced red wine sweetened with enough honey to preserve it long past reason. Claret wasn't just a beverage. It was a statement. A loud, sticky, intoxicating statement. You sip it, and your brain fogs in real time. Your teeth practically ache from the sweetness. But even the poor indulged now and then. Some made their own sweet infusions from herbs foraged in nearby woods. Others steeped dried apples in hot ale or poured honey into weak cider, calling it a treat. And occasionally on feast days, someone in the village would have access to imported sugar and throw it into everything, including drinks, including weird drinks. Remember, sugar was medicine. Technically, physicians treated coughs with sweet syrups, stomach aches with honeyed wine, and depression with licorice cordials. If it was sweet, someone somewhere was trying to justify it with science. You sit now near the hearth, cheeks flushed, sipping the last of your cordial. Someone's playing a lute badly. A pig wanders in and is immediately ignored. The air is warm, thick with the scent of smoke, mulled wine, and damp wool. You rest your head against the beam beside you, the sweetness lingering on your tongue, the heat in your belly, the poppy syrup doing what poppy syrup does best. It's not Coca-Cola, but it'll do. The tavern fades behind you, your breath sweet and warm as you step back into the night. The fair's winding down now, children asleep on hay bundles, torches crackling in sconces, and vendors packing up whatever hasn't been licked, spilled, or stepped on. You wander toward the outskirts, past a monk snoring on a bench, and a juggler mumbling at his own hands, until you catch another scent. Not fried this time. Lighter, sticky sweet. Familiar but not quite fruit. You follow your nose to a cart draped in linen and decorated with hand-painted vines. On the table, glass jars glowing in the torchlight filled with brightly colored globs, shavings, and cubes. The woman behind the cart greets you with a curtsy and offers you something that looks like crystallized orange peel. She says it's candied, real sugar, not for the faint of teeth. This is the realm of candied everything, even parsley. If it could be dipped in syrup, rolled in sugar, or dried until it cracked like glass, the medieval sweet tooth had already claimed it. Fruit was the obvious starting point. Dates, figs, apples, oranges, and cherries were regularly boiled in honey or imported sugar, then dried or rolled in powder for preservation and presentation. But it didn't stop there. Historians still argue whether candying started as a preservation method or a luxury display. But one thing is clear, the process was expensive. Sugar, still largely imported from the Middle East, cost a fortune. To candy anything meant you had both wealth and a disregard for moderation. In royal courts and noble households, this was practically an art form. Cooks would take rose petals, mint, or even fennel stalks, soak them in syrup until glassy, and serve them as delicacies. Candied anise seeds were used as breath fresheners. Candied horseradish, apparently real, probably acquired taste. You nibble the candied orange and wince, it's like biting sunshine. Tart, intensely sweet, and slightly bitter, but undeniably luxurious. The woman offers you another candied ginger, fiery at first, then mellowing into a deep, syrupy warmth. You take two. Monks in monasteries experimented with candying as well. They believed the process drew out both the essence of the plant and any spiritual purity it might carry. It also gave them something nice to chew on between prayers. Apothecaries got involved too, candying medicinal herbs like licorice, angelica, and violets, not just to preserve them, but to make them palatable, medicine by way of dessert. One popular medieval treat was comfit tiny seeds like caraway or coriander, coated in layers of sugar until they resembled shiny beads. These were served after meals to aid digestion, or at least to hide the taste of what you'd just eaten. Preparing comfits was an ordeal, coating, drying, coating again, sometimes over a dozen rounds. It was a flex, like having a 10-step skincare routine but for sugar. Then there were the marchpanes, what we'd call marzipan. Almond paste mixed with sugar and molded into shapes, hearts, birds, castles, fake fruit, and yes, occasionally something wildly inappropriate. Served at weddings, feast days, or whenever a nobleman wanted to show off by biting the head off a swan. a marzipan swan, thankfully. You take another bite this time, something chewy and green. Parsley, candied, and surprisingly pleasant. The woman laughs at your expression. Used to treat gas, she says, but now people eat it for pleasure. Or both. She offers you a cube of candied quince next, and you're not sure whether to eat it or polish it. It's dense, glossy, and smells faintly of apples and soap. One bite in, and it dissolves slowly, floral and rich. But this wasn't just about flavor. It was about control. Candying was alchemy for the kitchen, taking something ephemeral like a soft fruit or a fresh herb and making it last. The shelf life of a candied plum was weeks, even months. In an era without refrigeration, that was a miracle. And let's not forget appearances. In noble homes, platters of candied fruits and herbs were arranged like bouquets. Colorful, fragrant, shimmering like jewels under candlelight. They weren't just snacks, they were statements. If you had sugared violets on your table, you weren't just rich. You were cultured, refined, willing to spend 5 days slowly boiling flowers for the privilege of chewing them for 6 seconds. Meanwhile, the poor had fewer options. Honey was the sweetener of choice, cheaper, easier to produce locally. Some households would soak dried fruit in diluted honey, then dry it again on cloths in the sun. Simple, effective, and still a treat. Peasants might candy root vegetables, especially if they had a bit of leftover sugar from a rare feast day gift. Candied carrot anyone. You lean on the cart now, warm from the torches, your mouth coated in flower-scented sugar. The fair's almost empty. A few figures drift in the darkness, and somewhere a drum thumps faintly. The woman begins packing up her jars, but not before slipping you one last piece, a sliver of candied rose petal. It melts on your tongue like perfume, sweet, delicate, fleeting. And suddenly you understand medieval junk food wasn't just about hunger. It was about fantasy, escape. A sugared rose to forget the mud, the toil, the smell of the latrine pit just a few stalls away. You smile, eyes heavy, and wander off into the dark. The ground crunches softly beneath your boots as you step away from the candied herb cart, the taste of rose and quince still lingering on your tongue. The torches have burned low now, casting flickering shadows across empty stalls and curled straw. But your nose catches something new again, warm, savory, and slightly funky. You follow the scent to a small group huddled around a fire pit where a heavy pan crackles over the coals. A boy lifts a slotted spoon from the bubbling pan, revealing a blob of golden brown cheese. It stretches and droops with an audible squelch. Someone giggles. A man next to him tosses a pinch of spice into the oil and mutters something about making it sing. You step closer, unsure whether you're about to witness a miracle or an accident. This is where you discover a lesser-known medieval obsession: fried cheese, dairy sweets, and the curd-based treats that made both peasants and nobles weak at the knees. It turns out, long before mozzarella sticks hit the scene, medieval Europe was already experimenting with cheese as a medium for junk food. Think battered curd fritters, creamy desserts, and snacks that made noble courts swoon and monks question their vows. One of the most popular forms, deep-fried cheese curds. Simple, indulgent, and wonderfully messy. Recipes from the 14th century describe mixing fresh cheese with flour eggs and sometimes breadcrumbs, then frying until golden. Sometimes sweetened with honey or dusted with cinnamon. Other times served hot with mustard or a vinegar dip that screamed, "I regret nothing." Historians still argue whether these cheesy snacks were born out of necessity, leftover curds, Gatzels, no waste or extravagance because you could fry cheese. Either way, the results were glorious. You accept a fried curd ball from the boy. It's hot, gooey, and lightly crisped. The cheese inside is tangy and soft, clinging to your tongue like a guilty secret. A woman beside the fire hands you another, this time with chopped herbs mixed into the batter. Sage, she says, for digestion. You nod solemnly, pretending this cancels out the fact that you're now 5 courses deep into a medieval heart attack. And dairy wasn't just fried. It was turned into sweets so rich they could bankrupt a monastery. Enter blancmange, a sort of thick, sweet porridge made from milk, rice, sugar, and often shredded chicken. Yes, chicken. Don't look at it too closely. Served with almonds and honey, it was more dessert than main course by the 15th century. You've probably had weirder things on vacation, but the real star of dairy desserts was the curd tart. A cousin of cheesecake curd tarts combined soft cheese, sugar, eggs, and spices like mace or saffron inside a buttery crust. In noble households, they were molded into elaborate shapes, flowers, castles, or hearts to be served at weddings or lavish feasts. The crust was sometimes stamped with family crests or silly mottos. One noble reportedly had his tarts marked with the phrase, "Better this than nothing." You respect the honesty. And then came milk puddings. Some were thickened with rice flour or breadcrumbs. Others with eggs or even fish, gelatin. Medieval cuisine loved a curveball. The sweet versions were flavored with rosewater honey or sugar and served chilled when you could find ice, that is. In the summer, you'd just pray for a cold breeze and call it dessert. Even the monasteries got in on the act. Despite their vows of moderation, monks had a fondness for dairy indulgence. Curd puddings were especially popular during Lent when meat was off the table. They argued cheese wasn't really meat. Neither was butter, or eggs, or anything that could be disguised as essential spiritual fuel. Convenient theology, you think, as you take another bite of creamy fried cheese. Cheese also played a role in travel food. Hardened into blocks or salted beyond reason, it lasted for weeks. But the soft stuff that was celebration fare, and when it came warm, sweetened, and dusted with exotic spices, it became a guilty pleasure, a luxury, a moment of edible rebellion in a hard, gray world. You chew slowly, sitting now beside the fire. The others pass around a wooden bowl of sweet cheese dumplings dusted in sugar and clove. A little girl licks the bowl when it's empty. No one stops her. One of the men offers you a sip of spiced milk to wash it down. It tastes like warm custard mixed with regret and holiday cheer. A dog appears, snagging a dropped curd from the mud before trotting off triumphantly. Someone burps. Someone else begins humming a tune that sounds like it might be about cows, but you can't be sure. You lean back full now, in a way that's less satisfying and more surreal. The kind of full where everything inside you feels sticky rich and possibly alive. The fire crackles softly. The stars blink above you. And for a moment, surrounded by the scent of oil milk and singed herbs, you realize medieval people knew exactly how to eat themselves into a food coma. They just didn't call it that. Your limbs are heavy now, but your curiosity, bless it, refuses to sleep. You leave the warmth of the cheese fire behind and follow the fading hum of late-night chatter past rows of shuttered stalls. Then you spot it, a narrow wooden kiosk with a striped cloth canopy, faint candlelight, flickering behind hanging baskets. The air smells of cinnamon toasted flour and something smoky sweet. A wiry man, half hidden in shadow, is manning a small metal press. You watch as he pours a thin batter onto a sizzling plate, presses it shut, and waits. When he lifts it, a delicate lacy sheet of golden crisp peels away, still warm. He rolls it into a cone and dusts it with powdered ginger. A wafer. Not just any wafer. A medieval dessert so beloved it had its own fan base. These were the wafers of the wealthy, sweet-thin, wafer-thin, yes, Monty Python fans. You may chuckle and sold fresh by professional waferers. You take one from the vendor. It's still warm, buttery, and spiced like someone dropped a gingerbread man into an incense burner. Wafer makers were considered specialized artisans by the 13th century, especially in noble households. You wouldn't just whip these up casually. It took skill equipment and the patience of a saint to get them thin enough without tearing. Some were flavored with orange blossom rosewater or sugar syrup. Others were left plain and paired with spiced wine or soft cheese, and sometimes stacked. Yes, wafer towers. During feasts, particularly in France and England, cooks would stack these delicate discs into tiered constructions, sometimes up to 2 feet tall. They'd drizzle them with honey, stud them with candied fruit, and present them as edible centerpieces. Imagine walking into a party and seeing a leaning tower of sugar-dusted crunch. It would have been the medieval equivalent of a champagne fountain, impractical, unnecessary, and absolutely show-stopping. Historians still argue whether these wafers were strictly desserts, or sometimes treated as ceremonial bread, since they were often served with wine. Some believe they blurred the line between sacred and indulgent, especially when used in wedding banquets, where breaking a wafer together symbolized unity, or sugar addiction, depending on the couple. And then there were the savory wafers. That's right, not all were sweet. Some were made with spiced cheese leeks or even fish paste. These weren't sold on street corners, but served in private halls, usually as appetizers or intermezzos between courses. Yes, even medieval banquets had palate cleansers. You pause chewing your ginger wafer, imagining the moment someone says, "Yes, let's clear our tongues with a bit of eel spread on a crispy disc." You sit down on a nearby barrel as the waferer makes another batch. His press is decorated with carved patterns, fleur-de-lis vines, and something that might be a lion or a really angry dog. The designs stamp onto the wafer itself like edible art. Wealthy households commissioned their own customized wafer irons. Some even bore family crests, mottos, or religious symbols. That way, you could literally eat your way through nobility. By the 15th century, waferers were so highly regarded that royal courts employed them directly. England's royal household listed wafer makers in official records with designated staff to prepare and serve them on feast days. They had titles, salaries, and probably more job security than most medieval surgeons. But not all wafers were consumed at grand feasts. Street vendors, especially in France and Italy, sold simpler versions to passers-by. They were made fast and cheap, folded or rolled and handed out hot, just like your ginger one. The vendor hands you another, this one glazed with honey and folded into a triangle. He calls it Napolitane, though you suspect the recipe's taken more than a few scenic detours on its way here. You bite in. Crisp, brittle, with just enough spice to wake your sleepy brain. It shatters against your teeth, dissolving into something that tastes like toasted heaven. Around you, the fare grows quieter still. Even the torches seem to burn more softly, as if respecting the sanctity of this wafer moment. And while you chew, you picture the strange contrast of the wafer's life at one end, peasants leaning against a cart, licking syrup off their thumbs. At the other, nobles daintily nibbling embossed wafers in silk gloves, pretending not to get crumbs on their gowns. Same snack, entirely different vibe. You ask the vendor how many he sold tonight. He shrugs and smiles. Enough for supper and not enough for regrets. That feels about right. As you rise to leave, he presses one more into your hand. For the road, he says. Try it with honey and sleep. You nod. You will. Soon. Because as wafer crumbs cling to your fingertips and your jaw works through the last crisp bite, you realize sometimes all it takes to feel rich is a little sugar, a hot iron plate, and the patience to wait for the sizzle. You drift farther from the fare now, along a path lit only by the moon and the occasional torch flickering in the wind. Your boots crunch against stray nutshells and trampled reeds. You're full, so full, and yet something sweet and savory lingers in the air, calling to that last unreasonable pocket of curiosity in your stomach. You round a bend and find a cluster of benches outside a stone bakehouse, its hearth still glowing red within. A cook leans on a peel, one of those long-handled wooden paddles used to move pies in and out of the oven. He sees you, nods once, and beckons. You follow. He pulls something from the coals, a small golden pie, its edges crimped like a miniature crown. He cracks the crust open, and the smell hits you: raisins, cinnamon, saffron. And meat. Yes, definitely meat. Welcome to the strange and glorious world of sweet-meets-savory medieval pastries, where dessert and dinner not only shook hands, but moved in together. Pies in the Middle Ages were the Swiss Army knives of food. They could be filled with anything sweet, savory, edible, or possibly regrettable, and the crust wasn't always meant to be eaten. In many cases, it acted as a container, a medieval Tupperware made from flour, lard, and determination. The one you're handed is called a chouette, popular in 14th century England. It's filled with minced pork dates, cloves, and sugar. The cook assures you it's a good batch. You bite in cautiously. It's warm, buttery tender in the middle, with that slow-burning spice that makes your eyes flutter. Is it dinner? Is it dessert? You don't care. It's both. It's everything. Historians still argue whether medieval diners genuinely enjoyed the blend of sweet and savory, or simply endured it, because ingredients were limited. But surviving recipes meticulously recorded by noble households show real intention behind these odd pairings. The cooks weren't just making do. They were aiming for complex flavor profiles before umami was even a word. Consider the tarte de brie, a cheese tart sweetened with sugar and rosewater. Or pain ragoon, a dense pie made with honey ginger breadcrumbs and chunks of mutton. These weren't accidents. They were flavor experiments, occasionally successful, occasionally, well, memorable. One manuscript from the 15th century gives a recipe for pie of partridge, a partridge pie filled with dates, eggs, spices, and inexplicably sugar-soaked pine nuts. The goal, to create something that pleases both the noble tongue and the common belly. You're not sure whose tongue approved that combo, but someone definitely put it on a silver tray once. And it wasn't just meat. Fish found its way into sweet pies too, especially on fasting days when meat was banned, but loopholes abounded. Imagine a salmon and date pie with saffron custard. No, really. Someone did. Often. You ask the cook if people ever complained. He snorts. Only the ones with no teeth left. Fair enough. As ovens became more common in cities, pie making took off. Guilds of bakers, often specialized in pastry and recipes, evolved to reflect the preferences of each region. In France, almond pastes and dried fruits became staples of noble kitchens. In Italy, the crostata was born early versions stuffed with ricotta and candied lemon peel. In the Middle East, which heavily influenced European cuisine through trade and conquest, fruit and meat combinations were centuries ahead, featuring saffron rosewater and pomegranate molasses long before they became trendy again. And let's not forget the crust. Rich households often ate theirs, especially when made with butter or egg yolks. Peasants, not so much. Their crusts were dense, tough, and meant to be discarded or fed to the dogs. Still, even a pie shell soaked in lamb juice and plum syrup had its fans. Especially if you were 4 days into Lent and someone handed you a pigeon stuffed with raisins. A few pies were made entirely of sugar nuts and exotic spices. One popular variation was the tart of strawberries and boar, which sounds like a food challenge show, but was actually served at royal weddings. We know because a 15th century guest recorded it in his notes and raved about it. "May I never dine without it again," he wrote, which, knowing medieval food safety, may have been true. You look down at your empty hand, surprised to realize the pie is gone. The cook has another ready. This one's filled with beef currants and cinnamon. You politely decline. Your mouth says thank you, but your stomach is waving a tiny white flag. The cook nods, then wraps it in cloth and hands it to you anyway. "For the road," he says, smiling like someone who's seen enough eaters wobble off in a daze to know how this ends. And as you walk away, pie in hand, you realize in the Middle Ages, dessert didn't come after dinner. It came with it, inside it, sometimes hidden under a crust of salt and butter, and ideas no modern chef would dare tweet. But here under the stars, it all makes sense. The road narrows, winding past quiet huts and shuttered stalls. The air now thick with the scent of smoldering embers and sweet, earthy ash. Somewhere behind you, a lute twangs lazily into the night. But ahead, that's where the magic lies. You follow a flickering torch, and a faint bubbling sound like broth stirred in a giant pot. You come upon a low stone building with smoke curling through a slatted roof. No sign, no bell. Just a crooked doorway and a table stacked with weight. Are those candies? Yes, they are. You've stumbled into the secretive, slightly suspect realm of apothecary sweets, that shadowland where medicine and sugar blurred and junk food could literally be prescribed. In medieval times, sugar wasn't just a treat. It was a potion, a preserve, a powder for the wealthy and the wary. It came to Europe through trade with the Arab world and was considered an exotic luxury, rarer than pepper, more expensive than saffron. For centuries, only the upper crust could afford it, and even they often consumed it under the guise of health. And where better to explore these sweet little lies than the apothecary? Inside, the shelves are crowded with jars of jewel-toned confections, rose petal lozenges, honeyed almonds, candied fennel seeds, violet pastilles, and sugar-dusted pine nuts. You pick one up, a lump of what looks like pink rock salt. "Sugar plate," the apothecary mutters, grinding something mortar to pestle. "For digestion and heartbreak." Historians still argue whether these sugar-based remedies were genuinely medicinal or simply delicious excuses. After all, a tiny ginger and honey chew for seasickness could just as easily be sold today as a Whole Foods impulse buy. You sample a comfit. A seed could be anise or maybe coriander coated in layer after layer of hardened sugar. It cracks like glass, then melts away into syrupy spice. These tiny orbs were often served at the end of fancy meals, a tradition inherited from Arab feasting customs. Think of them as the medieval mint. But the apothecary isn't done showing off. He offers a dragée, a smooth ball of sugar and powdered cinnamon said, to aid digestion, settle wind, and according to some ward off the Black Death. You try not to snort at that last one. Hey, desperate times, right? There's something absurdly charming about this world of sugared pills and perfumed tonics. You imagine a noble lady, pale and fragile, clutching her embroidered pouch of candied violets, claiming she has to eat them or risk spleen imbalance. Sure, my lady, whatever helps. By the 14th century, sugar had wormed its way into nearly every medical text in Europe. Doctors, real or otherwise, recommended it for everything from melancholy to digestion, from fevers to fertility. And the flavors, lemon, ginger, mint, clove, even rosewater, whatever was fashionable, fragrant, or vaguely foreign. One curious standout, Manus Christi, or the Hand of Christ, a sugary paste of rosewater, gold leaf, and crushed pearls. Yes, actual pearls. It was given to royalty during fainting fits. You take a moment to imagine that. Oh no, the queen is swooning. Quick, give her the pearl jam. Apothecaries even sold molded sugar figurines for children. These weren't exactly teddy bears, they were saints' animals or odd little monsters. Some were meant to amuse, others to terrify. A sugar grim reaper for your sore throat, perhaps. Yet not everyone saw sugar as harmless. A few monastic records mention concern over unseemly fondness for sweetened remedies. One monk in the 12th century wrote that his brothers were more devoted to candied angelica than to prayer. Priorities right. Still, it wasn't just the monasteries that dabbled in this sticky science. Nobles began keeping their own sugar kitchens separate from the main cooking areas. These rooms were filled with mortar pestles, molds, and bubbling cauldrons of syrupy experimentation. Sugar sculpting became an art if you were wealthy enough to afford mistakes, or to accidentally start a kitchen fire. Both happened. You remember something the cook told you earlier, that sugar was once considered hot and moist in nature, which meant it was good for cold illnesses. It sounds ridiculous now, but back then that made sense. Just like wrapping bacon around a prune and calling it an elixir of vitality. The apothecary leans closer, offering one last item, a delicate sugar flower pressed and dried, faintly smelling of lavender. You pop it in your mouth. It's crumbly floral, just a little bitter, and entirely unnecessary. But isn't that what junk food is all about? You thank him and step outside into the cool night. Your teeth feel slightly fuzzy. Your stomach swirls with a dozen flavors. And your mind, it's starting to float just a little on a sea of syrup and spice. In the medieval world, candy wasn't for kids. It was for the sick, the sad, and the spectacularly rich. But for a fleeting moment tonight, you got a taste of their cure. The sky hangs low and gray, now soft as wool, and the wind nudges you toward the city's edge. There's a faint sound in the distance, metal on wood, a slow creak, then a soft, satisfying thwack. You follow it through narrow lanes until the buildings part and reveal a market on its last breath. Stalls are shuddering carts rolling home. But there, tucked between a hay wagon and a particularly suspicious pile of turnips, is a man with a hammer, a flat griddle, and a pile of waffles. Okay, they're not quite waffles. More like twisted, lacy crisps, intricate, golden, smelling of cinnamon and almonds. You dear traveler, have found one of the most quietly adored pieces of medieval junk food, the wafer. Not the bland communion kind, though we'll get to that, but the kind that flirts shamelessly with dessert status. Thin, crackling discs made from a mix of flour, egg whites, sugar, or honey, and a touch of spice grilled between hot, patterned irons until they resemble edible snowflakes. If you've ever had a stroopwafel or a pitzel, you've got medieval Europe to thank. And here's the twist, these weren't just idle snacks. Wafering was a professional craft, like actual guilds. You could train for years to become a master waferer, own special irons, guard your spice blends like state secrets, and sell your treats outside churches, inns, and courts. Waferers even had their own stalls in big cities like Paris and London. Serious snackers only. You approach the man, his fingers are calloused, his apron dusted in flour and ash. He barely glances at you before pouring a ladle of batter onto a sizzling iron. There's a hiss, a puff of steam, and then that sweet, crisp perfume. It's hypnotic. He peels the wafer free, folds it gently into a cone, and hands it to you, steaming hot. You take a bite. It shatters between your teeth like a sugar window, all warmth and spice and the tiniest kick of citrus. You immediately want 12 more. Wafer makers often had seasonal specialties, clove and nutmeg in winter, lavender or lemon in spring. In fact, during certain festivals, wafer stands multiplied like rabbits. Feast of Fools wafers. Corpus Christi wafers. Wednesday afternoon and the sun's out, you guessed it, wafers. But the real high-stakes wafer action that came during banquets. Picture a noble's feast, 7, maybe 8 courses deep. You've already endured peacock stew, eel pie, and a baffling number of jelly-based dishes. Just when you think you can't take another bite, bam. Out come the waferers strutting through the hall with steaming irons and bowls of spice-scented batter. They'd cook right in front of you sometimes, shaping the wafers into fans or scrolls or even little birds. Now here's the strange bit. Wafers were often paired with hippocras, a spiced red wine sweetened with sugar or honey. The combo was believed to seal the stomach, aid digestion, and stop that post-meal regret burp. Historians still argue whether this was genuine medical insight or just a delicious excuse to end dinner on a buzz. Either way, wafers and wine became a power duo. Kings demanded them. Churches tried to limit them. And common folk dreamed of them. Back in your hand, your second wafer is getting cold. You chew slowly, taking in the delicate bubbles in the dough, the faint pattern of vines and fleur-de-lis pressed into the surface. These irons weren't just tools, they were family heirlooms. Passed down, repaired, even customized with initials or symbols. Some medieval wafer irons still exist today, their metal faces worn smooth from centuries of sugar hits. And now let's detour briefly into holy territory. Communion wafers. Yes, were also made by waferers. But with stricter rules, no sugar, no spice, and absolutely no showing off with peacock-shaped molds. These were unleavened plain and pressed with sacred imagery. Still, some waferers made a decent side income working both gigs, mass in the morning market snacks by noon. Saints and cinnamon rolls all in a day's work. Of course, where there's heat and sugar, there's risk. Wafer irons could and did start fires. More than one medieval bakery went up in flames thanks to overzealous snacking. It's the price of indulgence, really. The man beside you flips his last wafer and begins packing up. The griddle cools with a sigh, and the sweet smell fades. You linger nibbling the last crispy edge, wondering how something so fragile could carry so much history. One last detail: in some cities, waferers were regulated like taverns. Too many wafers sold in one place, trouble. Why? Because people gathered. They loitered. They gossiped. And suddenly the authorities had a crowd. And crowds could get rowdy, especially after a little hippocras. So yes, dear traveler, your innocent little snack was once considered slightly subversive. Flavored rebellion folded in half and dusted with sugar. You move on the echo of that shattering crisp still in your ears, your fingers slightly sticky. You're starting to understand something very medieval and very human. Sometimes the simplest foods are the ones people fight hardest to protect. The sun has well and truly dipped below the skyline now. You cross under a sagging stone arch, the street narrowing to a single muddy track flanked by tilted houses and flickering lanterns. A warm, greasy scent hangs in the air, riding steam that snakes upward from a cauldron half buried in coals. You've stumbled across one of the medieval night's greatest treasures, hot street soup. Now you might think soup that's not junk food. But wait, let's talk about pottage. This wasn't some dainty bowl with a sprig of parsley. No, this was medieval Europe's answer to ramen. Thick, bubbling, questionable. A grab bag of scraps and carbs ladled out into cracked wooden bowls for a couple of pennies, if that. Rich in starch, mystery meat, and whatever hadn't rotted yet. It was the go-to fuel for anyone too tired or drunk to cook. Pottage could range from edible to what is that? You might find barley and beans, maybe an onion, maybe turnips, maybe a rat. Historians still argue whether certain urban legends about surprise meats are exaggerated or disturbingly accurate. There are records, one from a Paris court, where a vendor was fined for selling pottage of spoiled fowl and dubious leg. What exactly a dubious leg is? Well, let's leave that to your imagination. But the real star wasn't the soup, it was the stand. These were early food trucks in everything but wheels, set up outside taverns near city gates at tournament grounds. Some vendors got reputations. You'd hear things like, "Old Madge makes the best marrow broth, but don't ask what's floating in it." Others specialized in breakfast pottage. Yep, imagine waking up to a boiling pot of leftover sausage bits and porridge stirred together like some medieval hangover cure. It was salty, it was hot, and it soaked into your ribs like armor against the cold. And for a few coppers, it was the closest you'd get to comfort food. You step up to the stand. The woman stirring the pot wears 6 aprons and a permanent scowl. She thrusts a wooden ladle into the thick mass and flops a portion into a wooden trencher, hands it to you like it's a weapon. You nod, thanks. She doesn't nod back. You sit on a nearby crate, blow gently on the stew, and take a sip. It's surprisingly good. There's a hint of rosemary, a whisper of garlic, and wait is that lamb, a rare treat. You've lucked out. Now, pottage wasn't just one thing. There was white pottage made with milk breadcrumbs and sometimes almonds if you were fancy. There was green pottage filled with herbs and wild greens, usually during Lent when meat was off limits. And then there was frumenty, a kind of sweet wheat porridge that sometimes doubled as dessert if you threw in dried fruit and honey. Fun fact, frumenty was once served alongside venison at royal feasts. So yes, even kings dabbled in the medieval equivalent of a grain bowl. But back in the alley, there's nothing royal about what you're eating. You pause to fish out a chunk of something chewy, could be sausage, could be kidney, could be both. You try not to think about it. You take another bite. Yep. Both. At some point, a cat wanders over and eyes your bowl with disturbing intensity. Now here's the bit. Scholars get excited about these humble soup pots were often social flashpoints. Everyone gathered here drunks, pilgrims, merchants, pickpockets. Deals were made. Secrets were traded. You didn't just eat, you listened. Sometimes the pottage stand knew the news before the town crier. Some even say that street stew sellers were unofficial informants. A cook in London was once accused of overhearing a rebel plot while scraping the bottom of her pot. Did she make it up to get favor with the authorities? Historians still argue whether this woman was a savvy political player or just really into eavesdropping. And oh, the spice wars, they mattered here too. A touch of black pepper or ginger in your pottage was a sign the vendor had connections. Maybe even bribed a port guard, or knew a sailor who'd smuggled a pouch past customs. Spices could elevate your slop from barely edible to almost delicious, and some vendors guarded their spice blends like royal chefs. You finish the last spoonful and hand the bowl back. The woman snatches it, dunks it in a bucket of lukewarm water, and goes right back to stirring. As you wipe your mouth, you realize something: the pottage stand wasn't just a fast food stop. It was a pressure valve, a kind of edible peacekeeping force. When people were fed, they talked. And when they talked, they didn't riot as often. The cat, disappointed by your efficiency, slinks away. You rise, stomach warm, hands greasy, and head into the dark again. And just as you round the corner, you pass a man muttering to himself, arguing whether sheep's stomach was ever truly soup. You smile. Because you know now, when it comes to medieval junk food, the answer is almost always yes, if you're brave enough. The night thickens like treacle, and your footsteps start to drag. But just when you think you've had your fill of greasy snacks and questionable meats, a flicker of color catches your eye: bright ribbons, painted signs, and the echoing call of a bell. You follow the noise until you emerge into the glow of a town square pulsing with energy. It's not a market day, and it's definitely not a feast day. No, this is something altogether different. You've wandered into a medieval street fair, and that means one thing: dessert. Now let's set expectations. You won't find any triple-layer ganache cakes or rainbow macarons here. But what you will find is a sugar-drenched riot of medieval sweet junk food that'd make your dentist quit on the spot. First up, fritters. Deep-fried blobs of dough sizzling in lard until golden and crisp. Sometimes sprinkled with honey or dusted with spices, and other times stuffed with bits of fruit, apples, pears, or figs. These were the medieval doughnuts, and yes, people devoured them with both hands, juice running down their chins. You grab one from a stand where a young girl fries them on a flat pan over an open flame. She grins, tosses you a piping hot morsel with bare fingers, and warns, careful, it bites back. You chomp anyway. Your tongue burns a little, but you don't care. The outside crackles with a crisp sweetness, while the inside is steamy, soft, and faintly scented with cloves. Over to your left, a woman in a crooked bonnet hawks marchpane, a dense almond paste molded into elaborate shapes, some painted with edible gold leaf. These were pricey, usually for the wealthy, but festivals loosen everyone's purse strings. Tonight, even the baker's boy is gnawing a gilded rose. Marchpane, or marzipan, depending on who you ask, was the original edible art form. Sculpted swans, castles, and even saints. And because sugar was still a luxury, it was sometimes laced with rosewater or lavender to make it seem even more refined. Historians still argue whether marchpane was intended more for display or consumption. But let's be honest, when something smells like a flower shop and tastes like candy, it doesn't last long on the plate. You wander deeper into the fair, and pass another vendor roasting sugar-coated nuts, likely almonds or walnuts tumbled in a mix of honey and crushed peppercorn. The pepper gives it an unexpected kick. Medieval folks were really into combining sweet and spicy, even in candy. Why? Because spice equals wealth equals bragging rights. Then you spot something truly curious, a child licking what looks like a chunk of rock candy on a stick. You ask, and the vendor explains it's sugar crystal boiled down and hardened into translucent lollies. They're meant to soothe sore throats, but kids love them because they make your tongue blue. Because of course they do. And we can't forget candied ginger, imported and expensive, but considered both medicine and indulgence. Pop a piece and feel the warm burn dance on your taste buds. It's like nature's red hot, but with more sass. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some desserts came disguised as savory meals. One popular trick at aristocratic feasts was to serve meat-shaped confections, a boar's head sculpted entirely from almond paste or tiny sausages that turned out to be filled with jelly. Practical joke or performance art, historians still argue whether this was clever culinary play or just nobles showing off their sugar supply. But not all sweet treats were fancy. Many were simple joys made with whatever was available. Berries mashed with honey, cheese curds rolled in cinnamon, even dried fruits soaked in wine and spiced, then skewered and roasted like medieval candy kebabs. And if you were really lucky, you might score a tartlet, a little pastry shell filled with sweet custard jam or mincemeat. Yes, mincemeat. Because sugar was so precious, people added it to meat to stretch both. So your dessert might contain raisins, cinnamon beef fat, and a suspicious amount of clove. You eat it anyway. It's delicious. You're also mildly confused. One man near you bursts into a song about a fig pie so sweet, it made his wife propose to him. He's possibly drunk. He also offers you a bite of what looks like fig-stuffed pastry wrapped in leaves. You take it. You regret nothing. At some point, you realize your fingers are sticky, your pockets are full of crumbs, and you've somehow acquired a wooden token shaped like a cat. A prize, perhaps, for guessing the right number of plums in a pie. Who knows? You shrug and keep chewing, because tonight, you're not here for nutrition. You're here for joy. And that's exactly what medieval desserts were about. Momentary pleasure in a tough world. One sugar crystal, one fried fig, one honeyed walnut at a time. Your legs are heavier now, a quiet fullness settled in your belly after that sugar spree. But the night's not over. The lanterns flicker lower. The crowd thins, and your senses sharpen to the smells wafting from tucked-away alleys. Something meaty, something rich, and something that definitely smells like it's been roasting since yesterday. You follow the scent like a curious hound and turn a corner to stumble into a small, smoky enclave behind the main square. Welcome to the medieval equivalent of a late-night kebab stand, roast meat stalls, pie carts, and greasy spoon taverns all slinging the most beloved savory junk food of the age. First, let's talk hand pies. Think of them like medieval hot pockets, but less microwavable and more likely to burn your mouth in a spectacularly memorable way. Pastry wasn't just food, it was also packaging. A tough, inedible crust called a coffin, yes, really encased a mixture of whatever scraps could be found: chopped pork, bits of awful onions, eggs, currants, maybe even eel if it was your unlucky day. These pies weren't meant to be fancy. They were meant to be filling, portable, and cheap. You grab one from a scruffy boy with soot on his nose. The crust is charred on one edge, the inside still warm, and it smells oddly festive. You bite in and hit something soft and peppery, possibly turnip, possibly regret. Either way, you're not stopping. Next up, trenchers. Remember these? They're those stale hunks of bread used as plates. Well, what happens to trenchers after a feast? Sometimes they're thrown to dogs. Other times, reheated, slathered in gravy, and sold to folks like you wandering around after dark. A peasant version of fast food leftovers. One innkeeper near the edge of the square ladles thick, oniony broth over a trencher and hands it to you with a smirk. Better than soup, he says. And it is especially if you don't mind soup that's mostly bread. Across the way, a grizzled man turns a spit over a flame, his hands blackened with soot. Skewers sizzle kebabs of liver heart and mystery meat charred to perfection. You pick one at random and chew thoughtfully. It's spiced surprisingly tender, and probably better not to ask what it used to be. Some scholars think these meat sticks were a common late-night fix for laborers and drunkards alike, though others argue they were mostly tavern fare for soldiers. Historians still argue whether the skewers sold at street stalls were sanctioned by guilds or considered illicit trade. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve and nod at the man. He nods back, a grease-drunk understanding between two midnight eaters. Now for something quirky, bone marrow toast. Yep. Bread grilled and slathered in the fatty, buttery insides of bones. Marrow was considered both a delicacy and a working-class indulgence. It's rich, salty, and deeply satisfying, assuming you don't think too hard about the fact that you're basically spreading skeleton butter on a slice of rye. Speaking of rye, that's the bread of choice for the masses. If you're richer, it might be maslin, a mix of rye and wheat. And if you're really lucky, maybe even pure wheat bread, white and fluffy, reserved for clergy and aristocrats. But for your purposes tonight, you're just here for anything that soaks up the last of the mead swishing in your gut. You duck into a shadowy tavern, where tavern cheese is sold so-called not because it's made in taverns, but because it survives in taverns. It's pungent, aged, and possibly aggressive enough to have a sword duel with your tongue. Still, people eat it by the chunk, usually with strong ale and pickled onions. You try a piece and chase it with a swallow of cider so sharp it clears your sinuses. Now here's a slice of trivia for your sleepy brain. Ale-battered fish might sound modern, but in coastal towns, records show that fish fried in spiced batters was not unheard of. It was quick, easy, and made the taste of less than fresh seafood more bearable. Whether it was street food or served indoors is still debated. Some say it was a working-class treat, others say it was just a clever way to salvage spoiled stock. Either way, you find yourself nibbling a strip of something crispy and salty that just might be the ancestor of your favorite pub meal. But the real star of the midnight junk scene, blood sausage. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Pig's blood barley or oats herbs. Maybe onions stuffed into intestines and boiled or grilled. It's warm spiced, oddly comforting, and very much an acquired taste. You try a bite. It's rich, metallic, and weirdly cozy. One final surprise before you call it a night. A dish known as humble pie. That's not a typo. Made from animal innards seasoned with whatever was on hand and baked into a pie crust. It was common among lower classes, and despite the joke, not always humiliating to eat. The phrase eating humble pie came later, but the real thing, it's hot, savory, and strangely satisfying. By now, the stalls are closing. You've tasted the sweet, the salty, and the downright bizarre. You've burned your tongue on fried pastry, crunched through bone toast, and gnawed on skewered offal with the grace of a back-alley fox. And the best part, no one judged you. Because in medieval street food culture, everyone's hands are sticky, and no one remembers who paid. The streets are quieter now. The glow from shuttered inns spills in warm puddles across cobblestones. You've made it through meat and marrow, but your sweet tooth, it's a rebel. It won't let the night end without one final hurrah. So you follow a scent that's thick as honey and faintly spiced like cinnamon met its sticky doom over fire. You round a corner, and there it is. A stall with no sign but a long line of half-drunk townsfolk jostling for something hot and golden. Welcome to the kingdom of medieval fried sweets. First up, crispels. Think thin sheets of dough deep-fried and doused in honey. Almost like funnel cake, but denser, chewier, and less fairground-friendly. These crispels come out of the pan, sizzling the honey seeping down your fingers before you can even finish the first bite. They're warm, gooey, and weirdly addictive. No napkins in sight. Of course, you just lick your hand like an undignified noble and carry on. Next, Dowsett's a kind of milk pudding cooled into squares, then fried in lard and rolled in sugar. Or what passed for sugar. Sometimes it was just dried fruit crushed to a paste. The result, sweet, chewy, a bit smoky from the fire. Some even came stuffed with nuts or raisins. Historians still argue whether these treats were served during religious feasts or sneakily consumed in defiance of fasting rules. Either way, it's delicious enough that you start plotting your second helping before the first is done. A merchant offers you a fried apple turnover filled with diced fruit and sharp cheese. You blink. Cheese in a dessert, yep. The medieval sweet-savory boundary is a strange, wobbly fence, and tonight you hop right over it. The cheese is salty, the apples tart, the crust barely holding it all together. It's messy and bold, like the inventor was both a genius and deeply sleep-deprived. You drift toward another booth, where a woman fries little dough balls called crackles, drops them into a bowl of honey, then sprinkles crushed almonds and lavender, sure, why not? They're bite-sized. You eat 4 before realizing you've ignored the sharing platter sign. Nobody stops you. Nearby, a group of monks, yes, actual monks in night robes, are buying pannies fried in grease. Translation, bread cubes fried in bacon fat, then coated in syrup. You join them. One nods at you solemnly. Gluttony is a minor sin, he murmurs if you walk it off. You both laugh, then devour greasy, sugary chunks that taste like they were invented to silence guilt. Let's get a little fringy for a moment. Have you ever heard of rose petal fritters? Some monasteries cultivated roses for both scent and sweets. The petals were dipped in batter, flash-fried, and dusted with sugar. Fragile. Perfumed. You feel like you're eating a floral memory from someone else's dream. You pause. Stomach full head, light fingers sticky with 6 kinds of syrup. You sit on a low wall and watch a street performer juggle torches while balancing a tray of what he calls suquettes, candied nuts rolled in ginger, cinnamon, and honey. You pop one in your mouth. Crunchy, fiery, sweet. He tosses you another and keeps juggling. Somehow, this feels like the perfect dessert course. A few more facts to chew on literally. While refined sugar was imported and expensive, many sweets were made using honey date syrup or fig mash. Natural sugars, as someone today might say, though medieval folks didn't care much about glycemic indexes. They cared about flavor energy and whether the local friar might yell at them for overindulgence. A quirky favorite, Hippocras, a spiced wine sometimes heated, sweetened with honey, and served as a dessert drink. You sip from a warm clay cup passed down the line. Cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg. It tastes like someone liquefied autumn. It was considered both a digestive and a status symbol since spices were expensive. Historians still argue whether Hippocras was an upper-class indulgence, or if diluted versions were sold to commoners at festivals. Tonight, everyone seems to have a cup. You reach the final stall. A boy with sugar on his face hands you a warm square of almond milk rice pudding fried at the edges, soft in the center. It's creamy, nutty, possibly blessed by a pastry saint. You take a bite, then another. Time slows. Somewhere a lute begins to play softly. The wind shifts and a banner flaps gently above. You lean back against the stone wall, drowsy now. Your medieval junk food tour is winding down, but your taste buds are still partying like it's $13.99. You've eaten your way through fried doughs, candied nuts, cheesy apples, petal fritters, and spiced wine, all with the strange satisfaction of a traveler who's gone just far enough. Your stomach groans. You pat it gently, like, yeah, I know. But in a world without Oreos or pizza slices, this was the royal banquet of the streets. Your eyes are heavier now, your steps slower. But the night still has a little magic left. As the wind teases at your cloak, and the stars blink drowsily above you, find yourself drawn toward the softer side of the medieval sweet life. Because while fried treats ruled the feasts and festivals, there was another category of medieval junk food, quieter, slipperier, often tucked into pouches or clay jars and nibbled in secret. Welcome to the world of preserved candies, candied fruits, and powdered sugars. The pantry sweets. First, let's talk dragees. Today you'd recognize them as those shiny, often inedible cake decorations, but back then, they were much more than dental risks. Medieval dragees were tiny spiced seeds, fennel, aniseed, coriander, coated in layers of sugar or honey. Crunchy, spicy, and oddly refreshing, they were served after meals as a digestive aid. But let's be honest, they were candy cleverly disguised as health food. Like medieval Tic Tacs, only you couldn't keep them in your pocket without creating a sticky, disastrous mess. Tucked inside embroidered satchels or wooden boxes, preserved fruit pastes made from quinces, dates, or figs were prized snacks. Quince paste, called chardequins, was especially beloved, boiled down with honey until it set into a jelly you could slice. Think of it like medieval fruit roll-ups, but less neon and more royal banquet. You chew a soft corner and it melts slowly into floral sweetness, with a hint of something sharp, maybe wine or vinegar. Historians still argue whether vinegar was used to preserve or simply to cut the richness. Either way, it's got that perfect balance between sweet and tangy. There's a jar nearby filled with ginger preserves and syrup. A single spoonful coats your mouth with fiery warmth. Ginger was both a luxury and a medicine, allegedly good for everything, from digestion to romantic success, if you catch my drift. Not that you need convincing to spoon another piece into your mouth. Just imagine trying to smuggle this stuff into a monastery under the label tonic. And then there's candied peel. Orange or citron rinds boiled in honey or sugar until translucent. You take a bite, and it resists, then yields, then sends a bright citrus sparkle down your spine. It's candy that knows you don't have braces. There's even a rumor floating around that knights used to carry candied lemon peels under their armor as an emergency energy booster, or maybe just a treat for a moment of stolen quiet. Here's a curious one, rose sugar. Made by grinding dried rose petals with sugar and sometimes a splash of wine. This powder was used to sprinkle over soft cheese or custards or eaten straight off the fingertip like some powdered delicacy. You dab a bit on your tongue. It tastes like perfume, yes, but also like something delicate and strange, like you're kissing a poem. You stumble into a shadowed courtyard where two teenage apprentices are daring each other to eat a syrup candy made by boiling grape must until it forms a black tar-like jelly. You're handed a bit on the end of a wooden stick. It's sweet, but also smoky, like the grapes were cooked inside a chimney. You chew and chew and chew. By the time you swallow, one boy is still stuck mid-bite. Tastes like the plague, he wheezes. You laugh and disagree. Now for a truly quirky bite, comfits. These were similar to dragées, but bigger seeds, nuts, or even tiny herbs coated in layer after layer of hardened sugar. Making them took ages, dozens of rounds of tossing the centers in syrup and spinning them dry in heated pans. Monks with incredible patience sometimes spent days making comfits for their abbots. You try one with a fennel center. It's odd, sweet, sure, but also deeply herbal, like dessert was caught halfway through becoming medicine. Meanwhile, local children run past clutching candied nuts, the almonds still warm and fragrant from roasting with honey and cinnamon. You snag one, crunchy, nutty, pure joy. No scholarly debate needed, just happiness in a handful. It's worth noting, while we think of junk food as cheap and plentiful, many medieval sweets were expensive, very expensive. Sugar itself was a luxury imported at great cost. The poor had honey, sure, and fruit when it was in season, but a bag of imported candied ginger. That was upper crust material. Historians still argue whether rural peasants ever tasted some of these rarities, or if they remained the stuff of courtly kitchens and monastic treasuries. What's certain is that even if you only had one sugary bite a year, you'd remember it. You lean against a doorway now, nibbling the last of a sugar-dusted fig stuffed with ground almonds and pepper, yes, pepper. The contrast surprises you, but it works. It's rich and spicy and indulgent, the medieval answer to salted caramel. Above you, a faded mural on a stone wall depicts saints holding scrolls, and in the corner, one monk sneakily eating what looks suspiciously like a pastry. You smile. Some things never change. The moon is lower now. The wind has quieted. You tuck a piece of candied quince into your pouch for later. There's still one more adventure before we say goodnight. One last bite, perhaps, or maybe something weirder. But for now, just let that sweet tang linger on your tongue. You're not sure when the street turned into a path, or when the hum of distant marketplaces gave way to the quiet rustle of wind through trees. But now you're walking along a winding trail leading out of town, past grazing sheep and silent abbey walls, into the more secret corners of medieval appetite. Because while the feasts and festivals gave you the loud, sticky, honey-dripping heart of medieval junk food, it's in the oddities and outliers that the truly unforgettable flavors lurk. Let's begin with something unsettling. Fried animal skin. Not pork rinds exactly, but similar. In some rural villages, peasants crisped up goose or chicken skin into oily, crunchy bites. Salted perhaps spiced if the household could afford it. These were eaten straight off the cooling pan or with a piece of stale bread. You take a bite. It crackles, then crumbles into salty, greasy heaven. You feel a little guilty, but only a little. Next up, fermented fish paste sweets. Wait, what? Yes. Some scholars believe certain savory sweet combos like dried fish mixed with honey and herbs were made as portable high-energy snacks. Not common, thankfully, and the idea remains under debate. Historians still argue whether such recipes were actually consumed as candy or medicine or both. You hold a tiny brown pellet between your fingers and maybe skip this one. That smell isn't going to let you sleep tonight. Moving swiftly onto something more whimsical flavored edible paper. Known as Oblaten in German-speaking lands, this was thin rice-like starch paper, sometimes flavored with cinnamon or rosewater, and layered with sugar paste. Imagine a medieval fruit strip with a holy wafer vibe. Some monasteries even used them to hide bitter medicine. You place one on your tongue and let it dissolve feather light like a memory that wasn't yours. You round a bend and find a group of girls daring each other to nibble candied insects, bees mostly, or beetles, dunked in honey and sun-dried until hard. It sounds like a prank, but you hesitate. A crunch, a burst of sugar, and... okay, maybe not your new favorite, but oddly floral. One girl offers you a second one. You politely decline. Under an arched wooden bridge, an old woman sits beside a basket of cough sweets. She insists are both delicious and healing. They're made of licorice root boiled with honey mint and some mystery herb. You suck on one. It's sharp, medicinal, but not unpleasant. She cackles. See? Not every sweet's meant to make you smile. You pocket another for later. Now you're invited into a barn where a group of traveling performers are sharing cheese fritters dipped in wine syrup. Yes, you read that right. Soft farmer's cheese rolled in flour, fried, and dipped in warm spiced wine. It's weird. It's delicious. It's a medieval carnival in your mouth. You grin with greasy lips and someone passes you another. There's one more snack they're passing around. Bread cracklings made from leftover dough, rolled thin sugared, and tossed on hot stones until crisp. Not quite cookies, not quite bread. Just crunchy, sweet, addictive bites. It's the kind of thing a bored baker might make for their kids at the end of the day. You chew slowly, letting it turn to crumbs on your tongue. Suddenly, the barn doors creak open. A figure appears with a blackened loaf in their hands, burnt crust. But inside it's soft and strangely fragrant. Turns out it's spice bread, a mixture of stale crumbs, fruit bits, cloves, and molasses baked into something chewy, spicy, and weirdly energizing. You tear off a hunk. It's dense but warms your chest. The kind of thing you'd hide in your satchel during a pilgrimage. Here's a wild one powdered bone candy. Not real bones, probably. But rumors circulated of candies made with powdered eggshell or crushed antler bound with sugar and herbs used as love potions or fertility charms. You're offered one shaped like a tiny white rabbit. You nibble the edge. It tastes chalky, but sweet. And now you're slightly worried about side effects. You step outside again. The stars are faded, now pale smudges against the softening sky. Morning edges closer, like the end of a dream. But not before one last bite, a soft almond paste truffle rolled in saffron sugar. It melts the moment you taste it, nutty, floral, decadent. The kind of thing only a noble might afford, or a thief might risk their fingers for. Someone taps your shoulder and hands you a tiny wax-wrapped parcel. For the road, they say. Inside a candied violet petal. You let it dissolve on your tongue. Sweet, fragile, brief. Your footsteps grow slower. The wind is just a whisper now. And with one last swallow, we ease into the end of tonight's story. Wind down 300 words. Your journey through medieval indulgence is over now. The sticky sweet residue of honey, the spice-laced perfume of ginger, the earthy crunch of roasted nuts. They all fade gently from your tongue, leaving only the faint memory of strange laughter, candlelit alleys, and warm pastries in cold hands. The night around you has grown still. Even the wind seems to pause, letting the silence settle like a woolen blanket over stone and soil. You walk a little slower now, not because you're tired, but because you're full. Full of flavors, stories, and scents that no longer exist except in imagination. And in this dream we've shared. You think of the children chasing figs and fried dough, the monks hoarding comfits in candlelit corners, and the merchants whispering over rose sugar in back rooms. You think of that syrup candy melting on your teeth, of the ginger heat that still tingles somewhere behind your breath, of the edible paper that vanished like mist. Maybe you'll dream of it all tonight, of a world where desserts came wrapped in leaves and sweet things were rare, sacred, or just a bit suspicious. Maybe tomorrow you'll bite into something simple and smile, remembering the honey-fried apples or the burn of pepper hiding in a fig. But for now, let the last flavors dissolve. Let the breeze hum like an old tune. Let the quiet carry you gently away. Your pillow is cool. Your eyelids are heavy. The taste of medieval candy still lingers faintly at the edge of your senses. Sleep now, traveler. You've eaten your way through history. End of script. Sweet dreams.